Hey Notre Dame designers, this is a quick tutorial for how to do Sketchbook Pro design sketching. So let's get started. So first thing to talk about is posture and setup. So I'm going to rotate my camera a little bit so you can see what I've got going on. So I've got a Wacom tablet. It's a little bit smaller than the one that you guys have in the lab. So I have this kind of positioned underneath my drawing hand, and I have my keyboard over here off to the left, so I can use some of these hotkeys with my left hand. And I'm right-handed, so lefties might have to switch this orientation. So I'm going to share my screen and show you guys some basics in Sketchbook Pro. So here I've got Sketchbook Pro. I'm going to hide my zoom controls so that I can see my toolbar. So a couple things that you want to do first is go into Window and click on some of these tabs if they're not visible for you. So the ones that we're going to be using for the most part is Toolbar. This is the one at the top up here. We've got our Color Puck, which is up here. We've got our Brush Puck, which is over here. So these are really helpful for changing settings in your tools. We've got the brush palette open, which is here, and I've got it pretty simple. For some of you that are using different versions of the app, it may look a little bit differently, and you can customize some of the tools on here. I don't often have brush library open, but you can see there's plenty of different tools in here. So kind of like Photoshop, you can go in and add some of these and drag them over to your palette, but I usually keep that closed. Layer editor, that's over here. We've got our layer tab, again, a lot like Photoshop, but simpler and more streamlined. And then the color editor, which is over here. So this is what I use to pick all of my colors. So I usually have this open. Again, I'm right-handed, so I keep all of these tools over on the right-hand side of my screen because it's easier to access them, using the pen. Lefties might switch it. So a couple of the tools first, just to get you oriented. I'm only going to use 4 tools today. So I've got my airbrush. So that's up here, and it looks like that. So I've got it on its smallest setting, but you can also increase the size either. So this is the brush puck, either hitting the puck and dragging to the right, you can increase the size. Dragging to the left decreases the size. You can also use the bracket keys on the keyboard, a lot like Photoshop. So this is what the airbrush looks like. By hitting the brush puck and dragging down, you change the flow, so now it's lighter. You can also drag up, and then that's dark, right? So pure black here. And the color is up here, so if I changed to some different colors, we can see that reflected in the color puck up here. And you can change the saturation and the brightness doing the same kind of puck drags over there, but I don't usually do that. I usually just use the brush puck there. So that's airbrush, and I'll Control Z to clear this. We've got the pencil. So this is a lot like your Uniball or your Pilot or your Verithin pencil. You get really fine lines using that. Okay, so I'll use those two for putting ink on the page. And I'll use these 2 erasers as well for lifting ink off the page. So we've got a hard eraser. So I'll just go ahead and put some of this down real quick to show you guys the difference. Hard eraser makes a nice fine mark. And you can change how much you take off by doing that. So same kind of thing, dragging up and down. You can change how much you're erasing. And then also the soft eraser. So again, a lot like Photoshop, changing the hardness of your eraser. Instead here, we just have 2 default erasers, which are really handy to use. So this is your kind of higher hardness eraser, so I use this a lot. and then also the soft eraser. So those 4 tools are all I'm going to use today. So get familiar with those, and we'll do a little sketching here. So I've got my page. It defaults to widescreen, which is fine. And a couple keys on the keyboard to be familiar with. Spacebar lets you zoom in and out, as well as rotate. So that's super handy. I'm using that often to orient the page. And then S for swap on the keyboard. So I can go back between 2 tools. So like airbrush and eraser, for instance, if I have those 2, you can swap between the last 2 tools you use. So S and spacebar is usually where I'm keeping my left hand on the keyboard. All right, so let's sketch a bottle. So I pulled one that I liked off of the presentation that Anne-Marie shared. And just like anything else, it's easier to design in ortho than in perspective. So I'm going to try to replicate this in perspective, just using this ortho that I liked, and show you guys some of the tools and some workflow. So I've got airbrush on. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drag that all the way down as small as it can go. And I like that because it's a softer brush and a smoother stroke than the pencil. Pencil, it kind of fades out a little bit more dramatically. So what I'm going to do first is just rough in my design. So on a new layer over here, and you can add a new layer just using the plus sign. On a new layer, I'm just going to rough this in perspective. So I can drag a vertical line just holding Shift. So I can do that. I can also do a horizontal line if I want to, just holding Shift as I'm doing this. So that's a quick center line if I want one straight up and down vertically. And I'm going to give myself just some rough ellipses here, just to kind of get a ballpark for the proportions. So I'm going to rough in that cap, and my ellipses get thicker as I go down from a horizon line, which might be up here. So I'm not worried on getting this too exact yet. And again, you can hold Shift, drag this down. If you wanted more of a 3-point perspective, you could do that as well. So my goal here is just to kind of get this looking kind of in proportion and in perspective. This is called roughing in, or kind of working on an underlay. That's kind of what I'm doing. So it kind of frees you from worrying too much about your stroke. So I'm going to go in here, put a contour line for the cap. And that lets me kind of work this out in perspective. If you ever make a mistake, just Control Z on the keyboard. That undoes, not sure. All right. And this is still cylindrical. So maybe that edge looks something like that. And this has a little bit of wall thickness. I probably won't see much of that middle reveal in there. So yeah, keeping it loose. If you want to hit some of these ellipses, you might rotate the canvas and change your zoom. And this is an opportunity to kind of correct some of those ellipses. All right. And that might be it for now. If you're doing kind of low fidelity sketching, this is fine. You could add some hatch marks on this and stop there. That's totally fine. But I wanted to show you guys maybe how to do like a medium level. So, you know, what would this look like if we used this as an underlay? So I can just move this on the page and I can scale it if I want to, just using this tool here. So I might just recenter that there. I could also rotate if I wanted kind of more of a dynamic perspective, like if this was at an angle. All right, so let's change the opacity of that layer and make a new one. And this lets us maybe trace over this if we want to improve the line work a little bit. So I've got my pencil and that's kind of fine. So maybe yeah, that looks pretty good. And I want to show you guys the ellipse tool. So we've got some guides up here. So we've got an ellipse tool, we've got a ruler, which we can use. So we'll use both of those. So the ellipse, I can drag it and move it around using that center button. I can change the scale of it using this off to the side. So that changes the size. And then I can change the minor axis or the width of the ellipse by dragging like this. So that's kind of why I'm not too concerned about getting all these ellipses in perspective, because I can just use my guide here. And increase the width as I go down the page. If this is transparent, I might see some wall thickness. So I'll just change the size. Maybe I want to move that a little bit so I see more of that front edge. I drag this down. And you can see a little bit where I've maybe deviated from my center line, but that's no problem. Okay, so those are the ellipses down there. I'll just pick up the size of this again. Okay, so that looks good. So now I can work my way back up and start to thin out these ellipses as I get closer to the top. You can keep it loose by kind of letting a little bit of your tail of the ellipse show. And I don't need the one on the top because I've got some new line work up there. So it looks like my perspective is a little off, so I could just use this opportunity to correct that. And this kind of sketching is a lot easier if you've got an underlay to work from. All right. You can do double lines, single lines, whatever style works for you. Okay, I've built some of that transition. And now I could use Shift to go down here, but I also want to show you guys the ruler. So if you go to Guides and use the ruler here, it's also hotkey R on the keyboard. So I can align my ruler using the outer two buttons, and I can just move it laterally or around the page. using that middle button. So there we go. And then I'll line up the other side. Yeah, looks good. I'll put a little notch in here showing that maybe there's a part break, and come down with that chamfer towards the bottom. All right, that looks pretty good. Maybe I'll go back to the ellipse and give myself some of the hint of that wall thickness in that clear part. I got to change the width of that ellipse. I'll keep this line just a little lighter. And all right, that looks good. All right, so I'm just tracing over that line work there. I can leave it on if we like the look of having that kind of lighter out there. It's kind of nice to see some of these ellipses. But now what if I wanted to add a little bit of shading? So let me just hint at that there. So I can add a new layer, and maybe I'll go underneath everything there. So I'll go back to my airbrush and give myself a large brush because I don't want to see hot spots or streaking. I could pick a light source, so maybe I'll do that off to the left and get a little bit of value on the page. So again, I could hold Shift for this. So I might have a shadow on that side. I might have a little bit of value just kind of coming around the side there. That looks pretty good. I'll have that angled a little bit. So I'm just using a light brush, keeping light pressure on the page. And all right, so that's good to start out. So I can use my hard eraser just to clean up. If I want this to look pretty crisp, I could use the hard eraser. If I want it softer, I could use the other eraser. So I'll just show you guys the difference of that. Yeah, so I can bring that back pretty easy. I like to use large brushes, large erasers. It's kind of a technique called overpainting. So that keeps your shadows and highlights looking pretty smooth. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I might stop there for the transparent part. But let's say I want this to have kind of that rubber look there. So I'll just go back with another layer. And I can go kind of dark with this because with opacity, I can just drop it to where I want it. So in this case, I might use a hard eraser. And I'm going to work from the outside in. So that you can kind of just go back and forth with your eraser. And clean up this boundary. And maybe I'll drop the amount erased because maybe I want to hit this a little bit, but I don't want to take all of it off. Okay. All right, so that looks pretty good. I can drag this down if I want to merge these layers, if I'm satisfied with what I have. So I'll often do this just to keep my layer tab looking pretty clean. You don't have to do this, but I think we've all been in situations where we've got Photoshop files that are 60 layers large, and you can sometimes get lost in that. So I'll just add a little bit of highlight here. So maybe I'll pick up on that edge. Maybe I'll add a little bit of extra shadow in this chamfer. And again, I'm using large brushes, kind of over painting. And I'll go back up to erasing 100%. And go back. Use my line work as that boundary. Maybe I'll use the soft eraser a little bit on the edges. And what's nice about working always with a new layer is you have control over the opacity, so you can dial that in to where it looks good to you. And then I just merge down. Maybe I want a little bit more highlight on that side, so I'll use white. And I'll use my hard eraser just to manage that. I'll hold Shift to get a straight line. And use the soft eraser towards the bottom. All right. I can do the same thing with the cap. So I'll hold Alt, sample that color that I have there on a new layer. I'll use the soft eraser this time just to maybe speed things up. This doesn't need to be super tight, but maybe just the bottom, because I'll see that transition. Okay. And maybe just a little bit of shadow in here. So I'll go back to black. I'll use my eraser maybe to show that wall thickness. So really quick hack here. I don't need an extra line if I'm using a shadow like that. And maybe just a little bit of highlight over there. All right, that's about it. I could keep going, but hopefully you guys get the idea. 4 tools really to get started. So pencil, airbrush, hard eraser, soft eraser. Work with roughing in a layer to give yourself an underlay, and then use the pencil, use the guides to do any kind of cleaned up line work if you guys want. You can add contour lines, hatching, it's all extra, but this is the basics. So yeah, hope this is helpful, and happy sketching.